Fighting games can be pretty intense. Some of us go at it completely alone, while others need a little bit of help and patching up. Thankfully, there's always the fighter's first aid kit. So, you're new to fighting games. You're having a good old time often enough, but now and again you come across an opponent that just destroys you. Over and over again. The problem is that the character you're facing just seems to be faster than yours. No matter what you try, they're always allowed to strike before you do, leaving it an unwinnable matchup. Wouldn't it be nice if that was true? To grasp what is actually going on when this occurs, we'll have to take a peek underneath the hood. Under that fancy exterior of any given fighting game lies the actual game logic that determines what will occur in any given interaction between you and your opponent. The way that the fighting game community as a whole chooses to put words to and explain these interactions is called frame data. Frame data is a term you might have encountered before, outside of the community often being thrown around as proof that these games are incredibly complex. I mean, just look at all these numbers. In reality, frame data is just a convenient way to specify and quantify how your character's moves function within the game. You could think of frame data as different ingredients in a cake. While it might seem easier to immediately understand what a little bit of butter as opposed to 125 grams means, the correct measurements will let us consistently replicate that same delicious cake. In short, think of frame data as the recipes of your moves. It's not really any more complicated than that. Fighting games, as a general rule, tend to run at a locked 60 frames per second, and the frame in frame data refers to the number of individual animation frames an attack consists of. The frame data that forms the recipe of an attack can, as a rule, be divided into 3 different categories pertaining to you, the player: startup frames, active frames, and recovery frames, and 2 pertaining to your opponent: hit stun and block stun frames. To illustrate the first 3 categories, we will need an attack to apply them to. This simple jab will suit our purposes quite well. If we break down this jab attack into its animation timeline, we will get a sequence that looks something like this. This neatly posits us in the first category, called startup frames. Startup frames are what you could consider the wind-up of any given attack. That is to say, any animation that occurs before the actual attack has been fully extended. The number of startup frames govern how quick the move in question is. This jab attack will probably have a lower amount of startup frames than a spinning roundhouse. The second category, called active frames, come after the startup frames. Active frames represent the amount of time that the attack in question is able to hit our opponent. Our jab, being a quick poke, will probably have a very low amount of frames in which it can hit, while that spinning roundhouse might stay active for a lot longer. After active comes the third category, called recovery frames. Recovery frames contains all the animation that occur after our active frames end, but before our character has returned to a neutral state. You could think of this as the time it takes for a boxer's extended punch to return back to their guard. Again, here our jab might return very quickly and have a low amount of recovery frames, while our spinning roundhouse will probably take a lot longer to fully recover. If we take a look at our jab and our roundhouse, we can take the amount of frames and write them down as numbers to get a better understanding of the move's properties. The jab, being quick, only has 3 startup frames, but on the other hand is only active for 2 short frames. Similarly to its startup frames, it recovers in only 3 frames after the active frames end. The roundhouse, however, has 6 startup frames. But as it is a big swinging attack, it can hit the opponent for a longer time period, staying active for 5. Because of that strength, though, it has a whopping 12 whole recovery frames. When we then add an opponent into the mix, we have to consider the 2 final categories: hit stun frames and block stun frames. These categories are, just as their names imply, related to how many frames the opponent is stunned and unable to act by either getting hit or by blocking our attack. Let's focus in on our roundhouse, but this time it's going to hit something. If we look at this sequence in slow motion, we'll see that our opponent is put into a ton of hit stun frames by this staggering roundhouse. How long this stagger animation lasts for is only half of the puzzle, however. As we just went over, our roundhouse has a lot of recovery frames. So while it sends our opponent reeling, we have to bounce back to neutral ourselves. If we slow it down to a frame-by-frame analysis, we'll see that we have actually recovered back to our regular stance 5 frames earlier than our opponent. This means our opponent will be in hit stun frames and unable to act for a full 5 frames longer than it takes for us to recover, something that then allows us to act again before our opponent. This positive number is notated as a plus in frame data tables. So our roundhouse would be +5 on hit. If our opponent, on the other hand, blocks our roundhouse, we can see that they have recovered from block stun 4 frames faster than our roundhouse kick. These 4 frames that we ourselves are unable to act in are notated as a negative number. So our roundhouse would be -4 on block. This minus represents our character still being stuck in recovery frames of a move after our opponent has left their block or hit stun frames. If this minus number is high enough, our opponent will probably be able to get a free hit in on us before we have recovered. Okay, so what's the use of knowing how all these numbers work? Well, the foremost and probably most obvious benefit to understanding frame data is that you can easily break down if you're left in a position to continue pressuring the opponent after an attack connects on hit or block. If the frame data number says plus, that means you have the upper hand, and if it says minus, that means your opponent is able to act before you. Fighting game communities have luckily adapted a couple of nifty tricks to make these interactions more easily understandable. Firstly, when moves are listed in frame data tables or apps, they already have pre-made listings for on hit and on guard. The second, slightly more advanced usage of frame data relates to linking several attacks together in chains. By cross-referencing the on-hit number with the rest of your character's attacks, it is possible to string together several guaranteed attacks into a combo. If we were again to look at our roundhouse attack that we calculated to be +5 on hit, we can recognize that our other quicker attack, the jab, impacted the opponent on the 4th frame. If we add those two together, we can see that the opponent does not have enough time to leave hit stun before our jab connects, leading to an inescapable combo string. A quick tip here is that the first active frame is counted in the listing for the amount of startup an attack has in pretty much all notation systems used within the fighting game community. It is a bit unfortunate, but something one gets used to very quickly. This practically means that if a move says startup 4 in a frame data compendium, like our jab, it means it is hitting on the 4th frame, even though it technically only has 3 startup frames. The reason for this is that it makes it a lot easier to find out if something will connect or not. I hope that has cleared up why it might feel like you're magically getting hit all the time by faster characters. It probably only means you're hitting 2 slow moves at disadvantageous frame situations. A recipe for disaster regardless of how often you try it. And hey, if you still found it confusing, Leave a comment and I'll try help to clear it up. As an exercise, try looking up what moves your character has available as strong openers for pressure. Maybe the title you play has frame data accessible in-game. If so, great. If not, a quick googling of your game's name plus frame data generally leads you in the right direction. Try finding all the moves that your character has that are plus when guarded. And remember, the faster the startup, the better. Next time, we'll be taking a look at the other hidden properties that makes up moves in all fighting games: hurt boxes and hit boxes.